Alright, so picking up from our previous video where we already identified the dimensions for this particular assignment, we identified the dimension of service, vehicle, mechanic, and also diagnosis. The last thing, we also identified that we have a calendar basis of time or a period of time, and so this also creates our fifth dimension. So to answer this question, what are the dimensions, we should have the service, the vehicle, the mechanic, the diagnosis, and period, or some time dimension. All right, so now we're going to take a look at what are the measures. So the measures need to be numeric, and they also need to be able to give us some idea about the analysis that the decision maker wants. So these items 1 through 7 are the types of analysis the chief mechanic wants us to be able to do. So the chief mechanic is the decision maker. So we're going to analyze each of these statements. So the first statement talks about counting the number of services. We have already identified as services to be a dimension, and the week or month or when they occur by the week or by the month. So we know that this is services is a dimension. We know that this week and month is based on time, but count is nothing more than the occurrences of a particular record in a database. So we're not going to worry about counting the number of services in our database. However, the next example gives us the average of cost, and the measure that we want to be most concerned about here is cost, because cost is numerical. Average is what we do to cost, like sum the cost, average the cost, get the standard deviation of the cost. So cost is our true measure of a service. In the next statement, we want to analyze the number of services based on the vehicle type and make. So this is another counting type of a variation where we count the number of occurrences of each particular dimension. We're not going to add any kind of new measure based on the number of services. Keep following through. We see cost again of each vehicle type and make. We see the time in services. This is a new measure, and it's different than this time here because week and month is based on calendar time. The time in services is the duration when a service begins and when a service ends. So time in service is a new measurable that we need to include as one of our measures. And the last two, we have cost by diagnosis. Diagnosis is a dimension. Cost by mechanic. Mechanic is a dimension. So really, when we make an analysis of what the measures are, we're really looking at cost and then time and service. So we have two answers here, time and then service. Now the last thing is, what is a fact, or the grain of the fact table? And the grain of any kind of database is basically the smallest unit of analysis that is available through that particular database. So in this particular case, our smallest unit is the combination of a service performed by a mechanic on a certain vehicle during a certain time period of a certain diagnosis. So the way that we would write that, we try to put all of the dimensions and what our measures are into a statement that would identify the grain of the fact table. So in this case, we would say the grain of the fact table is the costs of the cost and time of services of this shop based on the mechanic, diagnosis, vehicle, and diagnosis. So with this information that we've combined above, we can now begin drawing our database diagram. So what we're going to do is start to take a look at what are the attributes of each dimension, and then start putting these together in a fact table. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a small diagramming tool in my Google Drive folder. So as App State students, you should be able to have this tool available to you. So for the purposes here, I'm going to go to New, I'm going to go to More, and I should have something here called diagrams.net. If you don't have diagrams.net, or also Draw.io is what it used to be called, you should be able to go to More Apps and include this into your Google Drive. So I'm just going to say this is going to be my ER, or I'm just going to say a diagram of the repair shop. And I will call this, I'm going to use the entity relationship diagram options, and I'm going to create. Now, for purposes of this class, I don't want all of the details that is identified here. So just in the basic standard, I'm going to delete everything that's there. And I'm going to change my my worksheet around a little bit more. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to where to go? I want to go to page setup, and I'm going to change the page setup to landscape, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. So that way, when I zoom out completely, I will see that this is more of a landscape setup for this particular page. The next thing that I want is I want to look at my entity relationship tools, not the general tools. So I'm going to be working specifically with the tools in the entity relationship area. So there's actually, in this area here, there's two items that I really want to pay attention to. It's going to be this table, and it'll be this item right here. And I'll show you how to use those as we work together. And then later we're going to come down here and then pull in one of these relationships, and then we're going to work with those as well. All right. So let's get started on the first one. What I'm going to do is pull this list item over, and what I want to do is start creating my dimensions based off of what we found in this particular assignment. So where did we go? Here we are. So the first thing is I'm going to start to take a look at what are the services. So simple enough, I'm going to create a dimension table here. Let me blow that up so we can kind of see what's going on. And I'm going to call this one dim, and I will call this the dim service. Sorry. And then the first item I know is I know that based on the description of the product, or the description of the word problem, each service has a service code and a description. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to call the first item the service code. And this is a unique identifier for this particular dimension, so that makes it a great primary key. The next thing that I have to have is going to be a description, so I'm just going to type description. Now if I want to have the data type included, then I'll also include the data type, and something like this might be a varchar 25. And for that, the service code, we'll just say for all intended purposes is nothing more than an integer. All right, that dimension table, that's all it's required, so I'm just going to leave that there. And I'm going to create a new dimension table. So the next dimension I want to look at is going to be the diagnosis. This is pretty straightforward. So it'll be dim diagnosis. And what do we know about the diagnosis? Right? The diagnosis also has a code and a description. Well, I could almost copy what was on the dim service. So I can just call this the diagnosis. I'll call it ID, and that is an integer. And that makes a good primary key. And the last thing, of course, is the description, and that is a varchar 25. And I don't need that last item. Do this one more time. We're going to have a dimension of the vehicle. And we're going to have a vehicle ID. Okay, now we always need to have an ID variable as our primary key, and it will always be an integer. And then we can continue with the rest of the attributes. So we can see here that the vehicle is going to have a make and also a type. So what I'm going to do on my own is I'm going to go through the analysis that we've done, and I'm going to complete my my dimensions, and then I'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about the fact table.